Get out of your own way. This is a phrase used ad nauseam by many self-help writers, usually as a reminder of the autonomy you possess if only you were conscious of how many of your obstacles are simply self-sabotage. However, what we consider obstacles, and the ways of thinking that can be considered self-sabotage, vary widely between such writers. Of course, it should be no surprise that with this writing, I aim to be yet another variation. In past videos, I've briefly mentioned the process of unlearning concepts. I'd even argue that learning and internalizing an idea takes much less time than unlearning one. Considering the theories of influential Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, this isn't a new revelation. He believed that you never really erase something from the mind, but instead relegate it to your shadow, hoping that you will not encounter stimuli that unpleasantly returns it to your conscious focus, even if ever so briefly. Really, when I say unlearning something, it can be realistically interpreted as suppressing an impulse until it's made vestigial. When one unlearns implicit racism, they're not forgetting every racist impulse or belief they had, but rather learn to put a mental barrier between the impulse and its expression. Sometimes this process is made easier if one learns a different, more healthy impulse to gravitate towards so they can reroute the impulse instead of always relying on the barrier. In short, one does not brainwash, but rather retrain. You cannot remove clay, but instead mold it into a different shape. When I removed the internet dark pattern scrolling from my life, my brain started to turn this impulse into something equally unhelpful by instead checking things for the sake of checking them. I'd check servers and forums for the same reason I used to in scroll, for the sake of easy gratification from the feeling of having kept up to date with meaningless things. While scrolling is the worst of these two patterns since it eats up more time due to the infinite nature of content delivery, both patterns are still considerably frivolous. I was foolish to assume that these patterns were something I could remove when the reality was that I needed to redirect this impulse somewhere else to achieve a healthier outcome. That meant enduring a lot of painful boredom until I finally replaced those freshly empty impulses with healthy ones. Just as the internet has become the bedrock of modern culture and behavior, so too has capitalism. Radicals say to unlearn capitalism and other ideologies, but this is difficult when such things change the way we think and talk so much to the point that even identifying every way in which it does this becomes a dizzying affair. It's appealing to consider rectifying this problem with brute force by trying to come up with a list of every expression, interaction, thought, and so forth that's affected by capitalist ideology and removing them from the psyche. But what might be easier and more practical to do is to adopt patterns where we can recognize these issues as soon as they approach us and label them as unhealthy impulses that we need to replace. Here's a couple examples. As a function of our lives, we play up our strengths and brush aside our weaknesses. Most believe this form of bullshitting is relegated exclusively to the job market and work environments, but this bleeds into our interactions with people we meet for the first time as well. In this way of behaving, you shed your humanity to instead act like a product. You're advertising yourself as a competitive labor product in the human resources market to an employer that you will hope will see you as the best candidate. Likewise, you're marketing yourself to a potential friend to make the prospect of spending their time with you feel worth the emotional cost of friendship. In the way we market ourselves, friendship and employment are just two different words to mean a contract you've entered because you've succeeded in selling yourself. While we don't have the luxury of doing otherwise in a business setting, because in those cases we are forced to play that game, in terms of socializing elsewhere, we need to remind ourselves that we're people and not products. Without the subconscious pressure of feeling that we have to succeed in the sale of ourselves to someone, we become a full person instead of a marketing facade. This doesn't mean you have to sit yourself down in front of someone and start going, well, I'm an alcoholic, my Ty sometimes talks to me, and if you dare offer me apricot-flavored Tutti Frutti, I'll have a panic attack. No. What I mean, rather, is that because you're a full person, you understand that there's more than just the sale you're making of yourself in that moment, since that friend is going to spend further time with you. It's a better gamble in the long run to just be honest about yourself and let your passions shine through unaltered, because you'd be surprised how well that works without having to lie. You wouldn't know if you've always been too afraid to try. Conversely, by giving up the unrealistic notion that you don't have flaws or that yours aren't that big of a deal, you're no longer blinding yourself from the next steps in self-improvement that must be made. In this regard, you can't fake it till you make it, because the flawless person is nothing more than a marketing ploy. They're marketing themselves to the world in no different a way than you do to an employer or a potential friend. it's a publicity stunt, and they're selling themselves as a public figure product. Assuming their facade through example only means inheriting their shadow instead of fixing your problems. Even though you might feel that, by changing this self-marketing impulse, you can finally think of yourself as a person instead of a product, you've already forgotten how I described earlier that this task is immense and cannot be attacked by brute force. The process of unlearning is lengthy and has to be chipped away at. Here's yet another chip in that process. Speaking earlier of self-improvement, when we've made moderate progress in the way of such a task, it seems to be a common impulse to berate ourselves by imagining how much further along we'd be if we'd started this journey earlier in our lives. Whether it's obvious at the time or not, you're thinking of yourself more as a stock market than a person. You're regretting not having bought this much stock in yourself earlier because you look at your returns and feel regret instead of contentment. Capitalism is one of the great enemies of satisfaction, because that feeling goes against its unrealistic goals of infinite growth. In the process of unlearning this aspect of capitalism from our lives, we don't just ignore or shut up this impulse, but have to consider in what way we should think of ourselves. If not like a stock, we alternatively have to think of ourselves as people, and having once been the person who was at the beginning of this self-help journey, we know that they'd be elated to be where we are now. I might feel bad about my life from time to time, but if I told myself from 3 years ago where I am now, they'd be jumping in joy with excitement of the future. This is no different than imagining how happy your starting self would feel about your present self in terms of a self-improvement journey. The perspective enables you to feel the contentment you robbed yourself of when you let internalized capitalist ideology get in the way of yourself. Usually the response to this stock-like impulse is the motivational quote, "The best time to start was the past, the second best is now." But this is still another way in which you're robbing yourself of your own satisfaction. We leave ourselves so many traps to not only act more like products and a stock market than people, but to continually rob ourselves of our own satisfaction even if we're trying to do the opposite. Capitalism has quite the fetish for this, and that unfortunately has become one of our greatest annoyances. Remember how I mentioned Carl Jung's concept of the shadow earlier? Another concept of his is called synchronicity, and will be the framework for why I disagree with that motivational quote. Synchronicity is the admission that, because of our highly pattern-seeking brains, we sometimes like to make connections between events that don't meaningfully coincide with each other because the joy of making that connection regardless can be helpful. For instance, you might be thinking of a friend you haven't talked with in some time, and just so happen soon after to bump into them. The takeaway isn't that you believe you manifested your friend by thinking about them or that such a thought changed the world, but you recognized that there's this loose feeling of synchronicity between the thought you had and seeing that friend. This can be taken advantage of in interesting ways as long as you're not crossing the barrier into superstition. One way I've done so is with a little fortune. The last time I ate out at a Chinese place, the fortune from my cookie read, "Your dreams will come true in December." Obviously, I don't believe that this slip of paper is going to change the events that were already going to happen in December. But what I'm doing by having kept that fortune in my wallet for some time now is that by keeping it present in my consciousness, I'm preparing myself to be open to and more fully appreciate positive happenings in the month of December. I'll tell myself that these things were synchronous with the fortune, but in reality, I'm tricking my pattern-seeking human brain to get more enjoyment out of the otherwise randomness of life. In terms of that earlier motivational quote, it makes the assumption that we only didn't do something earlier out of laziness or a personal failing. And I don't entirely disagree, but some of the best lies are half-truths. The problem I have is that this mantra makes us believe that this is always the case, when it usually isn't. Getting around to things is another aspect of synchronicity that I think rings the truest of any other interpretation. Throughout my life, I'd like to believe that the ideas I internalized, or the big milestones and tasks I got around to, I did during the time it was best for me to do so. While I could have done some of those things earlier, I might not have been able to fully handle such tasks or ideas. There have been times where I came across snippets of something profound earlier in my life, naturally rediscovered them later, and was happy upon such rediscovery that I was more capable in that later moment to internalize such profundities. Call it synchronicity, call it a happy coincidence, but when you sit down to ponder it, isn't that how human life usually works? You got around to doing something now because that's when you were in the best environment to do it. Why didn't you do it earlier? Because you weren't ready yet. You had other things going on. You were too busy. It was an extra spinning plate you couldn't handle just yet. That's all. So sometimes, the second best time was before, and the best time is now. But that requires you to think of yourself like a person whose capabilities change with time and not simply a stock market that's forced to make the highest returns. To the type of person who wants to go out there and do praxis, all of this psychological mumbo-jumbo about unlearning things or killing your heroes sounds boring in comparison, but the foundation of an effective revolutionary starts with these things. How are you going to do humanitarianism if you think of yourself more like a product than a human? How are you going to be a utilitarian if you still live your life on the belief that your best utility is towards endless productivity and not your community? Our world, both mentally and physically, is built off of these base assumptions laid out by the systems we're trying to dismantle. Building a different world means putting it atop a different foundation as well. So by questioning these very foundations, we can begin to live as the people of the new world.